Hi everyone. In case you're wondering what's with the get-up, it's actually to honor Mr. John Barrett, who's one of the best-dressed rum guys I've ever met. He is the founder and owner of Bristol Spirits, one of the first independents that received wide acclaim in the 2000s. But I mean, if you ever see the man at a rum fest, I mean, the guy is sharp. So I thought I'd give him this nod and a tip of the chapeau, just to say, listen, dude, you're kind of like the clothes horse I want to model myself after. Anyway, let's talk about Bristol Spirits for a bit, because Bristol Spirits still exists to this day after having been founded around 1995 by Mr. Barrett. So that means that he's been at this for about 30 years, if not more, because he was kind of like dabbling around in the field from before that. And he was the one who started this business kind of like a lonely enterprise, because it wasn't like there were a whole lot of people doing this kind of stuff back then. You know, the Renaissance didn't hit for another 10 years after he founded his company, but he persevered and he actually did a pretty good job. And I think we've all seen some of the really spectacular rums that he's made, which are like unicorns now. The 1974 Coroni, for example. There is the one bottle of the 25-year-old 1980 Port Morant at 50%, which a bunch of whiskey guys just freaking demolished at my house several years ago. You know, I mean, the man has put some real gems out into the open, and he's still going strong. He has now started to hand over the reins to his son-in-law, Simon, who is equally well-dressed. And I have a soft spot in my heart for these early indies. Renegade, the original Renegade, was another one, of course, as well as Gordon and MacPhail and 80 Rattray and so on. But there's always been something about Bristol Spirits that I liked, perhaps because they have resolutely remained a one-person operation until very recently. And one of my treasured memories of the rum world is one day when I was trying to figure out what the fuck was going on with some rum that I had tried that I didn't have enough information on. I called London on a Sunday, and somebody answered the phone and was very helpful, very kind, and lo and behold, it was John Barrett. And I had a really geeky fan moment for the guy, and I'm sure he was considerably startled at all this effusive praise and bullshit that he was getting from, well, the Middle East, right? So yeah, no, great bunch of guys, and the rums they've made over the decades really stand the test of time. One of them is this one. This is the Enmore 1988 at 43%. Mr. Barrett does not believe in over strengthening the rums that he makes. He tends to stay below 50% for the most part, right? This is one of the reasons I really like this is because, first of all, it's 20 years old. It was distilled in 1988 and was later rest probably and mostly in Europe, and then was finally bottled in 2008, and there it stood, and nobody was buying it. So there's me dicking around in Calgary one day, you know, in the 2010s, and I found it, and I bought it. I think it was like $80 to $90, which I was like, oh my God, you know, too much. But it was really quite a prize, and of course now it's become in itself a unicorn because it's so old and we don't see these things anymore, right? Which brings me to Enmore as a whole, and Guyana, and the distilleries and the stills and so on. It's a huge subject. A lot of the reason why there's so much confusion around Guyanese rums is because we no longer discuss the distilleries themselves. What we do is we discuss stills, and all of the stills that once used to dot the whole East Coast, West Coast, East Bank, West Bank, you know, all of them have now shuttered. All of them have now either had their stills destroyed or they got transported up to the Diamond Estate on the east bank of the Demerara River, which is where they all are now. So, you know, we can talk about the Diamond Distillery, but to say that is to create an impression that that's all there is. The truth is that all the recipes for the old rums and the settings for the various stills that they have from the old days in the 50s and 60s and so on, all of that remains there. They've got all this stuff there. So they can really create a Skeldon mark to this day, even though Skeldon was shut down as a distillery in 1960. And they can use the 13 or so stills they have there, you know, and, well, it gets confusing, doesn't it, right? Because this, for example, is the Enmore still, which is a coffee still made out of wood. And they've got two other wooden still, the Versailles still and the Port Morant still, which has got to be one of my personal favorites. So you just got to know your subject when you're talking about Guyanese rums. Now, unfortunately, Marco Freir's magisterial magnum opus on the distillery culture of Guyana, historical work, is now no longer online. I do have a copy that he gave me, but I'm not allowed to share it. But Matt Petrick's book certainly does a really good job of summarizing what's going on over there. He's done a lot of really primo research on the subject. And for the most part, as long as you know that the three wooden stills are the kind of like primo, the big ones, as well as the French Saval still, which produced one of the best rums ever made, the UF30E 1985, you're kind of okay with that. You don't have to know too much. The names of the marks kind of are self-explanatory to some extent, and there's lots of literature out there to help you. So let's get back to this. Marks don't mean anything here to Enmore. At least I've never seen one related to this. Back in 2008, nobody would give a shit, But Enmore, the Enmore distillate tends to be fairly straightforward in the sense that it's almost unmistakable. You can occasionally confuse it with a Versailles pot still, but not a Port Morant. And none of the other stills would give you something like this. Because when you smell it, what you're getting is pencil shavings, glue, paint, varnish, all that kind of stuff, a little bit of salt, and that's what you start off with. You get those woody notes, especially the pencil shavings. That's something I always come back to. You tend to start narrowing the field down into very quickly, and it reminds me of my old chemistry labs, in high school, where you were given something that would look green and you had to do a number of tests to figure out what it was. Well, for this, pencil shavings, Enmore, you're ready to go. Once it opens up, though, it starts to get really interesting, because now you get these luscious, deeper, darker, muskier notes of licorice and wood, tannins, sweet coconut sap. You begin to get caramel, toffee stuff. I mean, this is 20 years old in ex-bourbon, so you are going to get vanilla. You are going to get some of that standard kind of taste of toffees and so on. But there are fruits as well involved here, mostly the heavier, darker ones like prunes and apricots, very ripe, and peaches and that kind of thing. So, there's just a lot going on there. And this is one of the reasons why the reputation of this thing remains as good as it does. Now, of course, most of the Enmore distillate tends to get put into blends that El Dorado brand does. But occasionally you still tend to find these things. Oh, man, that's nice. Anyway, moving on from that, the taste is where things tend to get a little squirrely. I've never been convinced that it doesn't take a lot of skill to really bring an Enmore out to its maximum potential. It's a little bit thin. It's got those same sharpish notes of, pencils, rubber, a little bit of varnish, glue, paint, fresh plastic, that kind of thing. You can get past that, though. It doesn't last long, and then you get back into these heavier fruits and the licorice and the spices and the some people call it breakfast spices, some people call it allspice. I don't care. It's kind of like a sweetish thing. There's a bit of cardamom, a bit of cinnamon involved here, perhaps some nutmeg if you really pay attention. But overall, it's simply an incredibly nice dram. And at 43%, it's not going to really do very much damage to anybody. It's really quite incredible that the tastes are as firm and as distinct as they are. I find that really quite satisfying, because I tried a rum the other day that was at 49%, and it really was something of a disappointment, even though it was a pot still product itself and had been lightly aged for a while, so you would expect more. But in this case, you really are getting something, and that's, of course, 20 years in wood. You can't mistake that. Overall, I kind of like just dragged this out of my shelf, and I can't remember how much I scored this. It's in the high 80s. It's a really, really good rum, and it's just getting better all the time. Every time I come back to this, it becomes like a touchstone of the Guyanese stills. My love has always been given to Port Morant, and I find that it tends to have that balance of pot and column a little bit better than the Enmore ever did, but that isn't to negate how good this one actually is, and I can't recommend it enough. This is not one of those that you're going to find very often, but I bring this review out not to talk about this bottle specifically, but to tell you that if you run across an Enmore rum, from that still and that still alone, you aren't going to do too badly if you get it for yourself. They tend to be a little bit cheaper too than the Port Morant or the Versailles, which have much more limited outputs. So I would recommend that you give it a try if you ever do. And you know what? Bristol Spirits is always going to be one of my favorites. So Mr. Barrett, thanks a lot for everything, and I hope you keep making them for many years to come. Take care, everybody. Good drinking, and goodbye.